at large, and of course for all of the negatives that are associated with it. Government spying on these populations, big companies manipulating our attentions and influencing us in all sorts of ways, introducing fake news and whatnot. If you look at this debate and how it has evolved over the last decade or so, and I've been paying close attention to it, you will see that questions with regards to the possibility of these infrastructures of helping to organize our economy in a different way are almost never asked. And this is exactly what I meant by this end of history comment before it, because the default assumption that I think our internet debate has, it's that essentially capitalism won in 1989, the market had won in 1989, and all that we have to do now is to give these digital infrastructures for civil society and all sorts of nice public sphere players to manage and play with. There are no questions with regards to alternative economic models. There are no questions with regards to planning. There are no questions with regard to anything. This is not infrastructure for the economy. This is the infrastructure for civil society. And in as much as it is an infrastructure for the economy, it's only there to support startups, people building services, then packaging them as apps and selling them. That, I think, is the default unstated assumption that everybody operates with a few exceptions. The Chinese clearly don't operate with that assumption, and they never did. And the errors and the mistakes of people in Washington and Brussels and elsewhere with regards to China all stem from their own mistaken view trapped in the end of history. They still think that for China, for example, this digital infrastructures is primarily a threat to political stability. It's a way for civil society to organize. It's a way for journalists to spread information about human rights abuses. And of course, all of that is true, but it's undeniable that for the Chinese government, the primary use of the internet and of digital infrastructures is to organize the economy somewhat different from the model that we see in the West. And they're very consistent in that. If you look at how they've been thinking about big data, how they've been thinking about artificial intelligence, their thinking is tied to the possibility of planning. It's tied to the possibility of organizing economic activity in a way that does not rely on the market. And we have another interesting exception to this default consensus that the market had won and the internet is there to serve civil society, and it has to do with climate change. Even a journal and a newspaper as reputable as the Financial Times now runs editorials saying that because of climate change, we need to bring back central planning. It's a very strange set of opinions to feature in a journal like the Financial Times, but nonetheless, it's true. We are observing a sudden realization among some young people, but also among some policymakers, that perhaps market-based solutions are not going to get us off the most burning issue that we are facing, which is climate change. That said, the way we talk about digital technology in the mainstream debate, it doesn't reflect departures from the consensus, so to say. So I was always frustrated with the consensus view, in part because I understood that we are wasting time, and I think we've been wasting time ever since 1989, in not being able to come up with an alternative view of digital infrastructures and the internet that would put questions of organizing our economic activity differently. Right? And it's a very long prelude, but I think it's a prelude which will help you explain why on earth I have decided to spend almost a year researching a weird and obscure project from Salvador Allende's Chile from the early 1970s. Right? And I think it would suffice for you just to look at this photo to understand how weird and strange this project is, because it doesn't completely fit into our understanding of how backward socialism was supposed to be. Because of this conditioning that we have, because of this trap that I've mentioned of the end of history paradigm, and because of the wrong reading of the Cold War, we, of course, tend to think that socialism is something backward. It's something that would never give us a Steve Jobs. It's something that is supposed to be very bureaucratic, hierarchical, and that would never be able to build fancy devices and that are nicely designed, that are slick and glamorous. And that's the opinion that I also held for a very long time, growing up in the former Soviet Union. Of course, once you question this accepted wisdom, you immediately realize that there have actually been quite a lot of projects within even the socialist tradition, not necessarily the Soviet one. They did try to use technologies for things other than letting civil society organize, debate, engage in all sorts of public sphere activities. And of course, it's obvious that the primary use for infrastructure in any non-capitalist regime would be using it for planning. To be using it for trying to organize economic activity outside of the market. And this, of course, what happened briefly in Chile, where for 2 years and a little bit and a half almost, you had a very exciting project which culminated in this room, which I would say is the only memory that is actually left from it. I have this actually, maybe I should switch to the actual PowerPoint so you can actually see it as it rotates, because I think it's something that is worth examining. Let's see, well, you get the picture. This more or less what they're trying to build. If you think about it, it's a very strange project to launch in the early 1970s in the socialist context. Maybe I'll get rid of it so that you don't get dizzy from this rotating view. It's a strange project to launch because ultimately Chile was having all sorts of problems, having nationalized its industry. It was facing a lot of pressure from the United States, which imposed a blockade on it. It was a country with very limited computing power that had very little by way of computers. It actually could only spare 2 IBM machines to this project. And it had very little experience with either cybernetics or operational research, which were the 2 disciplines that have informed the construction of this room. And yet, this thing happened. And for me, the question that I've been trying to answer, not just within this podcast that I'll talk about in a little bit, but within my own intellectual work for almost a decade now, is what's the meaning of this project? What relevance does it have for our own struggles with big tech today? And how do you actually use stories like this to come up with an alternative reading of what the history of the internet, which we know was a Cold War project, is, was, or should be? Right? And I'm absolutely serious about it and about what I said at the beginning of my talk. I do think that our existing accounts of Cold War history and of the role of computing in it, they're inadequate. And they're inadequate to account for all the richness of projects that failed not because they were inadequate or they did not know how to use technologies, or they did not have enough people in their garages in Palo Alto doing yoga and building Facebook. They failed because they died in a coup like this project, and it was destroyed because there was a coup to overthrow Allende. And it's very worthwhile to be thinking what kind of imagination and what kind of interpretation we would have of digital technologies if projects like this one had actually succeeded. Whether we would be associating this glamorous cybernetic socialism with the maximization of democracy and innovation and not capitalism. Right? These are all sorts of questions that I think are ripe for examining and that we have not been examining as early as we should have since 1989. So if you look at this room, you will see that it has all sorts of ingredients and all sorts of components, which I will not be able to explain to you in detail every single one of them, but you can clearly see that even the story of a single chair in this room can be a subject of a dissertation or a podcast or a book, because this is not a regular chair to be seen in 1970 Santiago de Chile. The same could be said about these models that you see on the walls, where it's not just a very weird visualization of something. There is an entire theory that has been elaborated over 2 decades by the person who actually inspired this room. And to understand the construction of that theory and how it fit into the ideas that people in Chile at that time had about planning, you need to go and actually look at debates about economic development, debates about trade, debates about underdevelopment and modernization theory and whatnot. And essentially, those of you who don't know my intellectual background, I've written 2 rather successful and popular books critical of Silicon Valley and digital culture. And then I decided to go back to school and do a PhD at Harvard in history of science, working mostly in history of cybernetics. So this project was not the subject of my research, but history of cybernetics was. So it's been on my radar on and off for almost a decade. I've written a pretty lengthy piece for the New Yorker in 2014, which was tied to a book I was reviewing about this project. So I've been living in this universe, so to say, for almost a decade. And I must say that it still defeats me. It still defeats me in terms of complexity of the entry points to this story. I've listed here on a slide for you just a number of entry points that you can pursue to understand how on earth did that room actually end up in Chile and how on earth it was built. And you can see that there is, of course, a very shallow, action-driven story you can tell about those chairs and about those walls and about all the peculiar features of those chairs, that it needed to have a space we would put a whiskey glass, it needed to have a space we would put your cigar, or the fact that the screens that you see here, for example, this one, and the ones that you see on the wall, I mean, they do look very fancy, and you might think that it's a projection a little bit like you see behind me, but they were all actually hand-drawn, and there were people behind the walls who were actually inserting them into those screens. So it was all hand-operated. It was not fully automated because Chile just did not have the technology to do that. So it's a story where you do have a lot of anecdotes, and you do have a lot of points where you can easily build and construct a narrative without having to seek any of the entry points that I've listed. And yet, you quickly understand that if you don't try to locate yourself somehow in some of these disciplines, if you don't try to understand how those chairs actually fit into the history of design, if you don't try to understand how do those ideas about planning actually fit into the history of modernization theory or dependency theory or any of the debates about trade, if you don't try to understand how the idea of having a room where 7 people get together and they decide how the economy should be managed, how it fits into the history of management thought. Without those questions, you'll end up with a stream of anecdotes, but the stream of anecdotes is going to produce exactly the kind of effect that I myself have been criticizing in our existing Cold War histories of the internet or of Silicon Valley, where we fixate on colorful individuals who are very charismatic, and there is no shortage of charismatic characters in this story, or where you fixate on a certain, I don't want to use a fancy word like teleological, but a certain idea of a final product whose history you're narrating as if it was predetermined by God or destiny or something else. And that more or less is how we narrate most histories of the internet. We assume that you have to go back to 1960s and tell the story of how DARPA gives money to somebody and how that somebody eventually ends up giving money to somebody else, and you end up with Tim Berners-Lee, and from there you draw the narrative line to Facebook, and here you face a disaster of fake news, Donald Trump and Cambridge Analytica. Right? Those are the stories that are very easy to build and narrate, and you do have a lot of supporting material to work with. The problem is that you almost don't open up any possibilities for imagining how history could have turned differently. right? And for me, looking at the story without wanting to locate this alternative path that were not taken, it's pointless. Because for me, the point of looking at something like this, it's one, and it's to try to imagine how do we get out of this trap where all we can think about is how to regulate these giant technology platforms without imagining what other infrastructures we can put in place to actually have some kind of emancipatory vision for how society should function. And without being able to articulate that vision, and without grounding it in something, perhaps a historical example of some kind, perhaps a project like this one, it's almost impossible to get out of this cage that we built for ourselves with this debate about what to do about big tech. So the entry points are many. I'm not going to go through all of them. But the exit points, if I can call it like that, are also many. If you look at the coverage of Project Cybersyn, which is how this project is called, in the operations room that it has produced, you will see that there is no shortage of interpretations of what it actually was and what it represented. All of them, of course, delivered from the vantage point of today. It's almost irresistible and maybe impossible to look at that room and not to come up with a narrative of some kind of how it was a precursor or the beginning of something. And then that something becomes, depending on your view of where we are right now, either something very bad or something good or something very promising. So one of the first framings of Project Cybersyn in that room that you've seen was that it was a prototype of socialist internet, that it was essentially an alternative that was there, but it was abandoned because the coup intervened. Another way to think about it is it was just one of those big brother experiments that was to enhance the power of the government and of the state in controlling the populations. And you look at it, and of course the first metaphor that comes to mind is that it was just one of the early examples of the NSA-like surveillance that Snowden and others have documented. You can also find precursors to this big data hype in it, that essentially it's a way to collect as much data as you can, analyze it, make sense of it, and then use it for managing. And people have done that too. People on the right who believe in the triumph and the primacy of the market have looked at it, and they have argued that it's essentially a proof that planning never works. And the evidence for that was, of course, that you had those people behind the walls changing the photos and the paintings and whatnot, which I find a somewhat weak argument. You can go down that list, and you will see that there is virtually no end to potential interpretations of what that project was and what it means. And when you end up with a situation like this, where the entry points are infinite and the exit points are also infinite, and I haven't even touched upon non-tech exit points, it becomes an almost impossible story to narrate or to finish. And that probably explains why I'm not playing you the trailer for the podcast or any of the episodes as was originally planned, because the work of working on a project with an infinite number of starting points and an infinite number of threads proved to be rather daunting. And I'll show you what exactly that means very soon. In addition to this logistical challenge of having an abundance of interpretations and starting points, you also have, as I said, an extremely charismatic character at the center of the story, this guy. And you can clearly see that even though he still holds his cigar in the same way and stares more or less at the same point of the camera, something changed in his ambience and his attire. And it's a story of a man who went essentially from being one of the most highly paid consultants in Europe and in the United Kingdom specifically, who was working with some of the largest corporations of his times, to being a rebel and a socialist and a mystic who abandoned his Rolls Royce and his mansion and went to live in a cottage in the middle of a forest, traumatized by the experience of Chile and traumatized by the experience of that room being destroyed. When you have a character like this, you clearly attempted to forget about the history of design and the history of cybernetics and the history of planning and just focus on this character who, among other things, had 2 wives, a partner, 9 children, and friends like Brian Eno. And the more you dig into it, the more odd things you find, like the fact that David Bowie, for example, listed him as an influence in one of the interviews, clearly introduced into his reading list by his friend Brian Eno. So you have a storyline almost written for you, and yet I found it extremely difficult to tell the story I wanted to tell in terms of what it all means for today by focusing on this rather charismatic man. And this is him, by the way, in Chile in the early 70s, working on Project Cybersyn. You can see that the audience of this man dwindled over the years. He was a very popular speaker once with thousands of people coming, and then you only see 5 or 6. That, by the way, is the cottage in Wales where he ended up living. The problem with this man is that behind the charisma and behind the cigars and behind the whiskey and behind the gentleman club in London that inspired the operations room that you've seen, there were also very complex theories. And if you really want to do him justice, you need to understand the theories. And that's an illustration of one of his theories, the main one, the viable system model. Good luck understanding what it all means. I did eventually understand what it all means, but it requires reading 4 or 5 books, 500 or 600 pages each, with a lot of obscure references in them. This, by the way, is an illustration from one of the books, just to give you some rough idea of a context. And if you can't read what it says underneath, it says, case study, activities involved in failing to sell a single item worth less than 100 pounds. So this essentially is a diagram of a non-event. It's a diagram of something that has never happened. And when you find yourself with material like this, and if you really want to do justice to the story, you have to be able to connect this graph to the photo of the operations room, because there is no way to do justice and understand what's going on there without understanding that graph, right? And once you find yourself in a situation like this, you understand that it's not going to be a podcast where you interview his wife and his kids and his neighbor, and we've done all of that. It's a podcast where you'll end up interviewing 100 people, and you'll have to read all their books, and you'll have to read all their articles, and you'll have to ask them very detailed questions. And then maybe after a year of work, you'll be able to make sense of all the transcripts. And that's more or less where I find myself after a year of work. It's a story that has proved almost impossible to finish, but I'm finishing. And I'm pretty sure that I will not really reach a definitive conclusion as to what all of that meant, because a definitive conclusion here is impossible. And it's impossible because the meaning of this room, for me at least, changes based on the way in which I look at the world around me and I look at the debates around me. And if the first essay I wrote about this project in 2014 for The New Yorker was trying to analyze it from the perspective of, hey, these people were pioneering big data, now, almost a decade in, I look at it more as an example of how digital infrastructures can power an alternative to capitalism, right? And it's a very different paradigm, and the questions I'm asking are also very different. To maybe get you to the more exciting part of the story, let me reflect a little bit on some of the challenging aspects of it all. As I said, the temptation in a story like this is always to go for the low-hanging fruit when it comes to storytelling. It's to go and narrate the story of this guy, the story of the chair, the story of the people who invited him. And it's a truly remarkable story. If you think about the person who invited Stafford Beer, the cybernetician that I've shown you, to Chile, a man by the name of Fernando Flores, his own story is remarkable. He starts as a technocrat in Chile and ends up as an entrepreneur in Silicon Valley. working very closely with Terry Winograd, who happens to be the advisor of Larry Page, the founder of Google. So you can actually draw all sorts of direct influences between this project and the Silicon Valley of today. And there is prison, there is a coup, there is concentration camp, there are seminars on cybernetics organized in a concentration camp. I mean, the story is just too good not to be told that way. And yet, as I said, at least me, somebody who comes to it with a set of questions about the future, with a set of questions about the current state of the internet, I could not just follow it on its own. And I kept asking questions. To what extent is that room unique in the Cold War? So this project had a name, as I said. It was called Project Cybersyn. And if you look at history of technology projects throughout the Cold War, you see plenty of them, at least plenty of them that we know of. Project Troy, Project Camelot, Project Cambridge. You can draw a very long list of a dozen projects involving computers and big data of some kind to essentially influence foreign audiences. So there were Cold War projects involving propaganda, involving predictions of unrest, involving predictions of revolutions. All of them, of course, were done from the other side of the Cold War. They were not done by the socialists in Chile. They were done mostly by the CIA and the Pentagon. So in that sense, there is something truly unique about Project Cybersyn, at least as a project. But then you start thinking more about it, and you discover that, of course, the most successful projects of that kind, at least on the other side of the wall, would be the projects that we've never heard of. Because essentially, the rationale of people inside the CIA, for example, and inside the Pentagon, as I discovered interviewing historians of the CIA and historians who've looked at it for this project, the rationale of most of them was to prevent revolutions and socialists from taking power like they did in Chile. So they were using computers, they were using computer games, they were using simulations, all in order to find out how it is that they can keep the status quo in power. So if projects like Project Cybersyn from the other side of the wall actually succeeded, we would never have heard about them, because the whole point was to preserve reality as it is and not to intervene in it. And in the process of researching this podcast, I've actually found a very interesting computer game devised and funded by the Pentagon to actually plan a simulation about a potential revolution in Chile. And the only reason why we found out about it is that after the coup of 1973, a whistleblower from this project came forward and went on the record saying that I helped to build a computer game that helped to overthrow Allende. Right? But that whistleblower is one out of hundreds and thousands who never said a single word. And that made me thinking about invisibility. Just how many projects like this were invisible, and how much the visibility of this project was due to efforts of people like Stafford Beer and of other members of the project to keep its memory alive. Because essentially all that we have left of this project are photos of that operations room. I mean, we do have letters, we do have some things in the archive, but it never properly worked because the coup intervened at a point where its activities had to be interrupted. So they never actually put it to use. And once you have a phenomenon like this, it really makes you wonder to what extent its unfinishedness, the fact that it never actually became operational, much a little bit like the Allende's regime itself, to what extent it explains its appeal. Because the reason why we look at it with such fondness and such warmth is precisely because it communicates a certain idea of utopia that could have been but never was, and we don't have the evidence that it would not have worked. Unlike many other projects that we see in socialism and communist history, which did experiment with cybernetics, just that this project did not really go very far. And then once you kind of put this considerations on the table, you start wondering to what extent this whole story was a myth to some extent, propelled and designed by people like Stafford Beer, partly because they knew that that was the only way to make that experience known to the broader world. And you go and read the transcripts of his talks, and you go to his archive, which I've done, and you listen to a lot of people who've known him, the stories that he tells about that room and of his meetings with Allende are almost the same, word to word. A person who was involved a little bit with the project made a very interesting remark to me that had they not built that room, which, to be honest, was a rather peripheral part of the project, the whole point of the project was to represent the Chilean economy and to manage it. So the entire intellectual content of the project had nothing to do with those chairs. But had they not built that room, we would never even be thinking about this project. It would just remain a footnote. Which, again, it's a very tough message to communicate in audio form, such as the podcast. And as I started looking into this, I, of course, discovered that you can tell a story of this not as something that's exceptional, not as something that lies completely outside of computing history or Cold War history, but that forms part and parcel of efforts in Latin America to actually articulate and build their own alternatives to the capitalist modernizing system that was imposed on them by the imperatives of the Cold War. And as I started looking into it, I discovered that there were experiments with computing in Venezuela, in Argentina, in Peru, in the early 1960s and early 1970s, that to some extent prepare grounds for this. And yet we don't know about them. And we don't know about them probably because they did not hire a fancy designer from the Ulm School of Design in Germany to build fancy chairs that look so memorable to all of us. But in a sense, studying this also made me re-examine a lot of assumptions that I had about the Cold War and the role that computers played in it. Because if you look at the origins of this before Cybersyn in places like Venezuela and Argentina, you see that these people are actually taking over the computers and the methods that the Americans bring them. So it's essentially the tools and the methods and the infrastructures of what they perceive to be their enemies that are brought to those places to help them preserve the status quo and to preserve the possibility to essentially make it impossible for revolutions and unrest to break, that are studied by mathematicians, that are studied by cyberneticians, and that are then being put to a very different set of uses. And essentially they're being used to break free from the modernization agenda that was being preached to them from Washington. And the story of Cybersyn, in a sense, is a very similar story. Because if you look at Stafford Beer himself, this guy that I've shown you, in the days when he was still wearing his business attire and had his beard nicely trimmed, he developed most of the tools that ended up in the operations room that you've seen in the context of running a steel factory in United Steel. The simulation of the economy, the simulation of all the processes, the operations room where people come and decide, the ability to involve workers in the management of it, the modeling of all activity that happens in different parts of the enterprise, all of that is already present in the context of him trying to optimize the running of a capitalist steel factory. And yet those methods are taken up and implemented in socialist Chile and are being put, or could have been put, to very good use. Right? And it's a story that is much less linear and that is much more complex than the usual story that we hear about the Cold War giving us some kind of a closed world where computers are used to control everything or to spy on the populations. It's a story with many twists and turns that you understand cannot be easily pigeonholed into a narrative of computers make us free or computers make us slaves. Just to show you maybe the craziness of interviewing more than 120 people, this is a map of all the interviews that I've done, just with the names of the people on it, linked to various topics. I mean, I have various visualizations of it. I think that this is probably The resolution is not high enough to see it. It's another way to represent this map. I was really aiming for the same aesthetic as Stafford Beer in his graphs, and I think I kind of got to it. The challenge that I found on the technical side of this, so I can talk a little bit about the kind of the kitchen of how you make a podcast like this. It has to do with the fact that normally it would be the stuff probably of 5 dissertations, where you would have 4 or 5 years to sit quietly in the library and to work on this stuff by visiting different archives and interviewing one person a month so that you can prepare the questions by reading all those books. I've set myself the deadline of conducting all the interviews in 5 or 6 months, and I never imposed a limit on how many I should be doing. So I ended up with days where I would have 5 interviews a day on certain days. And when you have 5 interviews a day and you have to interview a historian of design, a historian of cybernetics, a person who used to work for Allende, and the child of Stafford Beer, you end up seeking as much help from technology as you can, because you essentially need to understand how to prepare the questions. You need to understand how to read all the literature you need to read to ask them those questions. And you need to understand how to make sense of the answers, because the day after you probably have another 5 interviews and you'd better ask them smarter questions that are already informed of what you've been told today. Most of those things, because the rhythm of working on this was so intense and somewhat crazy, most of those things I found out in the process of working on this and not before. So all of the right processes for analyzing the transcripts of the interviews, of transcribing them, of attaching metadata to them, of all of that had to be devised and improvised along the way. For the next podcast, I started building myself a very nice interface built on this system, whereby once I finish an interview, metadata gets attached to it. You can actually recognize all the people and concepts mentioned in each interview. And you can actually start automatically drawing all the data from different data sources like Wikipedia or YouTube or Google Books or anything else, and automatically populate pages for the main characters of the podcast, so you can actually go and, without wasting any time on general research and opening a gazillion different tabs in your browser, go and quickly read and watch and read and explore, right? And once you understand the principle that every interview transcript has a lot of anecdotes and sound bites, and this is the stuff you need in your podcast, but it also has a lot of metadata, right? It has concepts, it has institutions, it has names of people. And once you scale your interviews beyond just 1 or 5 or 10 and you end up with 100, you want to start analyzing this metadata, and you want to start analyzing it in real time, because you want to understand whether you're being said something new in the answers by your interviewees that you didn't know before, or other people did not know before who wrote books and articles about it. So for me, it became obvious that when you start working on a podcast, you need to start with a very long list of all the possible people, all the possible concepts, and all the possible institutions in it, so that you can actually start comparing every interview you make against that list to understand what is genuinely new in it, who are the new people mentioned in it, and what kind of research leads you can find. Because for me, it's not a bunch of anecdotes that attach to a narrative that has already been formed in my mind, and I'm just fishing for sound bites. If this is what I was doing, it would be far less interesting to me, and it would not really be any kind of research endeavor. For me, the whole point of it and the pleasure of it is that I don't actually start with a thesis. I start with a bunch of research questions, and those research questions get crystallized into broader reflections. As I do interviews, I read books and I read articles, right? And this is where, I understood that I need to be using software that probably nobody is using for podcasts. It's a software used mostly by qualitative sociologists, where to analyze and code essentially the interviews that they make. So for example, if you look at that photo of that cottage that I've shown you, here I have, because I've analyzed 100 interviews here and I've attached a code to every single interesting paragraph that I found of use, right? And you can essentially select any paragraph you want, and you can say, okay, here they talk about nationalization of copper, so I'm going to apply a code, nationalization, sorry, it's not, I don't have my mouse here, so it's a bit strange. Right, so you can just say, here we want to put the word copper, and you put it, and it becomes marked with it. So essentially, metadata that you can attach manually, but this is also metadata that you can attach automatically here. And then, you do have a fantastic bird's-eye view of particular elements of the story. So, you know, I can actually go and say, okay, this is everything I know about the cottage where this man lived after his nervous breakdown. And I can say, okay, show me all the quotations that you have, and then export all of them to Excel. And once I export all of them in Excel, I actually end up with very nice quotations that I can use to illustrate anything I want. I want to illustrate the lack of water in that cottage. I have all the quotes. I want to illustrate perspectives on the chimney. I have perspectives on the chimney. I have everything. Right? And then I started building extra scripts to export it from Excel to Word to make it look nice, and so forth and so forth. It does all sorts of network visualizations. I mean, I'm not going to get into all of the nitty-gritty of it, but essentially, for me, this podcast, and this is not the last one I'm making, it became an alternative way of thinking and researching that perhaps is even more intense and intellectually enriching than writing a book. I do think that, of course, there is a little bit of overkill in this, and there was an overkill in this from the very beginning, and kind of thinking that it's a normal idea to interview more than 100 people in 3 months. In the middle of a pandemic where some of them were 90-year-old and never actually used Zencastr or Zoom or anything of that kind. So I actually had to have teams in Chile and Argentina and Brazil and France and UK traveling around and miking them up and me beaming in online to talk to them. But essentially, the intensity of it all and the amount of materials gathered and the fact that there were so many entry points and so many possible ways to tell that story, it also made me devise a much better system for handling research data. You know, so here, for example, all these pages you're looking at, they're created automatically every time I upload a new transcript to the back end of the system, right? And I can actually see, okay, in the last 5 interviews, you see a certain trend emerging because people are talking about this person and this person is related to that person. So you can actually start doing all these network visualizations and the spotting of connections in a way that would probably be hard to do in real time with that intense schedule of interviews and also with that breadth of topics. So essentially, what I discovered is that it could also be a nice way to build your own bespoke knowledge management system, which I discovered they just don't exist as such. I mean, they exist as in you can go and look things up on Wikipedia and you can use various services to transcribe, very badly, by the way, to transcribe interviews, especially if people have accents. And mind you, in this podcast, fortunately, I speak a lot of languages, so I had to interview people in Spanish and Portuguese and French and whatnot. It was a bit of a multilingual project. But aside from that, you don't actually have the tools for doing this with this level of depth and this level of revelation of connections, if you will. So maybe I will stop here. I mean, essentially, the message I would like to leave you with is that we should not think about podcasting as a way to tell stories only and as a way to kind of splice up a lot of nice sound bites together and put a story on top of them. I think we should think about it as a potential way to do research. And in my case, the research has to do mostly with oral history, But some of that, of course, involved also archival visits, and I did have people go to archives of MIT or the university in Liverpool, where Stafford Beer's archives are, and work with me remotely to produce that. And then the question becomes, what supplementary additional media forms do we need in order to make all of that research visible? So clearly, in my case, I mean, what you're going to hear in a month or two, once all of this is hopefully finally over, would be a series of episodes, nicely edited, with a lot of interesting people ranging, from Brian Eno to the ex-president of Peru to a lot of historians and academics, and a lot of the people who participate in Project Cybersyn, and a lot of me. But it is clearly just 0.5% of the immense research materials that have been gathered. And I'm perfectly aware that for many of these people who are in their late 80s, early 90s, that's their first and probably last interview. And if anything, I'm going to use 5 words of what they told me. And for most of them, I'm not going to use nothing in the final episodes because I just have an abundance of materials. So it essentially made me think about other ways to recycle, if you will, that data, and to recycle that research and to make it live. So a big chunk of my time recently has been spent figuring out what kind of a supplementary website I actually need to build for this so that these stories come out and that people, researchers, journalists, I mean, you won't believe how many people are into Project Cybersyn and Stafford Beer these days. I mean, there are people writing songs about both, and there are people making podcasts, and there are reading groups, and it's a kind of a interesting community. But how do you make that data available to them? How do you make it easy to find? How do you make it easy to navigate? And how do you make this universe of research material that I had to read and consume to formulate the questions also visible to the people who would like to take that extra step? Right? I understand that for most people, this story will not be as life-transforming as it is to me. They will listen to their 8 or 10 episodes and they will move on to the next podcast. But I do think that there will be 5, 10, 15% in that crowd that would like to go a little bit deeper. And for them, you do need to give reading recommendations. You do need to give them podcast recommendations. You do need to give them video recommendations. You do need to point them to books. And then you start wondering, why are other podcasts not like this? You can, of course, have a very banal answer. There's a question of resources, budget, fetishism of the person producing the podcast. But, I could never understand that phrase that my editor, The New Yorker, once threw at me, that the quality of an article is judged by the quality of the stuff that's left on the floor during the editing process, and that's kind of a metaphor from Hollywood. And I mean, I get it, yes, that's great, but there are probably so many people interested in figuring out what was left on the editing floor, especially if what was left on the editing floor has involved more research than probably most of the academics do on an average day, on an average week, right? And then the question becomes, how do you make that part not just an add-on and a bonus, but how do you make it an equal part of the podcasting project? And I think I have an answer for it, but I'm going to present it to you when the podcast launches with a companion website, so to say. So I know that I've been going on for almost 50 minutes now, so I'll probably shut up and give you a chance to ask some questions. Thank you very much. Thank you. I think I'll have to repeat your questions because you can't be using a mic, so that's what they told me. So yes, please. Yes. Yes. So, I mean, it's a great question. Some of it, so this graph, for example, that I've shown you, the one that was super complex behind me, This is a default feature that goes with the software I was showing you, Atlas TY. You can build this graph, and I mean, you need to have a lot of ingredients and metadata to draw it, but the visualization part is super easy. You can have it like this. Yeah, yeah. You know, I never, so, you know, some people call me sociologist, but I'm not really one. You know, I'm a historian by training. And I didn't even know that that software existed, to be honest. And I discovered it in the process of doing research because I just understood that if you were using Microsoft Word, if I was using Microsoft Word, the Google Docs, this project would take 25 years to finish, by which point everybody I interviewed would be dead. So I needed to find a shortcut, and I found it, and it proved to be a shortcut that is much more powerful than any of the other tools. And again, it made me reflect on just how much, because you know, I'm always thinking about why our public sphere is not producing tools like this and making them available for everybody to use, because our libraries should be building this software and making it available to everybody. Our universities should be doing that. And yet they aren't doing it, and you have to pay a lot of money, well, not a lot of money, but some money to use the software. But beyond that, I'm thinking about what to do with the backend I've built. Because you know, for me, the most interesting part is not the visualization, it's not manual coding, even though what I didn't show you is that what this software does, which you might find interesting, is that it also auto-codes. You know, so if you want to say, okay, I have this fantastic interview about, let me see, what interview is that? It's an interview about Chile and labor in Chile and trade unions and how they were taking over the factories. And if you want to say, okay, I want to find all the names in this interview, and I want to tag paragraphs that mention these names, right? The system will do it for you automatically. You just need to go and say, you know, this is the interview I've chosen. You say, find all the institutions, find all the people, and the system will do it for you, just taking a while. I do it on a desktop normally. But the backend analysis, comparison of transcripts, configuration of APIs, because you have to configure it to work with Google Books API. You have to configure it to work with YouTube API. You have a lot of technical things to do. And unfortunately, nobody has done it as a service. Like, it's not something you can just install off and it will just work. But who knows? Maybe we will make it available. Maybe not. I mean, right now, to be honest, my thinking, my head looks more like this, meaning that I'm still trying to navigate all these connections. You know, and these are not even connections between topics. They're just connections between names. These are names of the people I interviewed and how they relate to topics. Imagine if I were to do a map of how the things they told me connect to each other and eventually connect to Stafford Beer. Well, yeah, sure. I don't know how much time we have, but yeah. Yeah, it's a great, so this is where, yes, yes. Yes, so essentially this is where you need AI, and this is what, you know, what I was trying to show you here. Maybe I will show you it if I manage to find, yes, if I manage to find the right. Essentially, you know, now you do have the capacity to automatically recognize names, institutions, and concepts inside text, and you can automatically label it. So this program, for example, does it automatically. I don't know if you can see it, but I've taken an interview transcript and I said, find me all the institutions, find me all the names, and find me all the geographic locations in it. So if I now click, you know, show results, because I haven't chosen anything, sorry. If now I'm going to click show results, it's going to show me all the parts of the transcript where these concepts or names or institutions are mentioned, so I can attach metadata to it. I mean, here it's semi-manual, but you can do it completely automatically, because if you use the services from Amazon or from Google, it's essentially, it's a cloud service now. You can go and just say, I want named entity recognition, and it will find all of them for you. The question then becomes, how much control over this do you want to have yourself? Do you want to build your own vocabulary for the project by analyzing all the books? In my case, for example, There are books written about Project Cybersyn. There are books written about cybernetics. There are articles written about it. So I actually analyzed all of them, and I generated a vocabulary for the project. So I knew what are the key terms to watch. Once you have that, then it's just a matter of almost mechanical comparison of the transcript and the vocabulary. But to build the even the transcript, you need to have some way of transcribing the audios, correcting the audios, and making sure that if you do introduce a person to correct the transcript, that they know how to transcribe certain names, because who knows who that person is talking about if you're new to the concept. Long story short, with some basic technical skills and imagination, you can pretty much automate 90% of this. Yes. Yes. Well, the distinctions, it's basically, well, you have metadata attached to an interview transcript. You upload a transcript. Then you have an automated trigger because the metadata, you assume that all the metadata is valid and it's interesting. So you basically have pages created automatically in the backend, and all the data is pulled automatically. It's not that you have to go and check every single one of them, but if you do stumble upon a new name that you hear in an interview, you want to see, is it already present in my files or not, right? But that part, it's entirely automated. Any other questions? Goes beyond the story of a few charismatic individuals. Yes. And why a podcast? Yes. Well, it's a good question. I don't have a good answer to the second part. Why a podcast? Because I was invited to do one. So, you know, for me, the question was, what can I do with this form and medium that would be different and new and truly interesting that I wouldn't do with a book? The question of how do you condense it to 8 episodes, it's hard. But it's hard because, you know, even though I know that this story doesn't have an end, it doesn't have an end because there is always another dimension to it, right? It's almost like this Russian doll that never ends, and there is always a doll inside. And, but at some point, you just have to assume that you've done your homework and you've done it thoroughly, and you trust yourself to make sense of this material, being honest to the interviews, but also being honest to the public. Because, you know, I know for a fact that, and, you know, this is why having a backup website to go with the podcast, it's very reassuring because I know that ultimately you can repeat my exercise and build your own story if you really want in your head, because you can go and read this 100 transcripts and look at all of the supplementary materials and say, hey, the story you're telling me, it's complete nonsense. The story that really is buried inside these transcripts is this. So in that sense, I think it's honest because I don't believe in objectivity as a kind of thing that you can achieve. And as long as I don't believe in it, I would like to be subjective, but I would like my subjectivity to be computational, so to say, right? So you can go and build your own subjectivity, you can build your own narration out of the same materials, and I'll show you what the materials are. It doesn't, of course, give you, it's not a utopia of total transparency, in that short of making an entire model of my brain, you would still not get to ask the questions I asked, and I would not ask the questions you asked. But I think it's a start. And it's in that sense, a lot of people will find it bizarre and revolting, and they would say, I am the master, and you shouldn't look at how the sausage is made. And to some extent, you don't see how the sausage is made because the real sausage is made here. It's not made in the interviews, and it's not made, and it's made, because this one, for example, what I didn't show is that it also has this memos part, where you can actually make your notes and you can write down these things. You can write if you find a cool phrase, you can write down how you want to, so at some point I made a note, potentially episode title, Smaller of Cocktails and Empanadas. I'm never going to use it, but it's all stored here. right? And you can time it, you can do whatever. You know, you find an interesting image, you drop it here, and you know, you have all the images collected that you would like to use. I mean, it's pretty nice, but this is what the sausage is made, and you don't really see, you will not see all of it on the website. Yes?
So I have a technical question regarding your backup
Yes.
website, right? So
Yes.
you have all this material, which you're going to upload on this backup website.
Yes.
And are you then going to do automatically putting in the RSS feed to each episode, or
Mm-hmm.
did you just also automate?
No, no, no. So, well, I mean, it's not, meaning, let me put it that way. A lot of thought has gone into the website. So, you know, because, I mean, look, in a project like this, given what I've shown you, clearly if you're reading an interview with, you know, the world's leading professor in artificial intelligence that I've interviewed, Terry Vinograd from Stanford, it's a great interview, but you really need to know the context to understand what he's saying. So, you know, we're using the website as a way to also like introduce that context. So every time he mentions a name that is super important, but you might not know, there is a little footnote in a pop-up integrated organically into the website and into the page that tells you who that person is. You know, there is a glossary on the website where you can actually go directly from each interview and see who those people are, who those concepts are, because I understand this is not a story that, I mean, I could ask you to define cybernetics and probably most people in this room wouldn't even tell me what it is, other than it's some weird science, right? So it does require a lot of context, and we are introducing the context, but it's also obvious to us that the website should stand on its own, meaning that it should be an entry point to the project, but there should also be a supporting material for people who arrive to the website from the episodes. Because you listen to the episode, and in the episode itself, we mention, you know, if you listen to this episode, and this episode we talked about history of nationalization in Chile, how the workers were taking over their factories, you should listen to the bonus interview we have with this woman, and it's on the website, right? So there is a very organic integration with different levels of content, with the interview transcripts, with the supplementary materials, with the episodes, with the glossary. It's quite well thought out, I hope. Yes. Okay, I'm being shown that we've run out of time. Well, thank you so much, and hopefully, thank you. You should remember about this talk in about 6 or 8 weeks when this will actually go live. So thank you so much.